Hey everybody, thank you for being here today for From Spectrum to Screen, representation of autism in the media. This is a topic that I'm super passionate about, and so I'm hoping that I can convey some of that passion and some of my info onto all of you. So a quick bio before we get started, just so I'm not this talking head hanging out here. I am Cal. I'm a queer and neurodivergent undergrad student in Alberta, Canada. Specifically, I'm in neuroscience with a particular interest in cognitive neuroscience and in developmental disorders. I'm kind of a blend of like an academic advocate performery kind of person all put into one. And I will talk about cephalopods, neuroscience, and sapphic media pretty much anytime, anywhere, anyone. I have so many fun facts that I would love to tell all of you. So an overview of what we're going to be going over today. I've divided this presentation into 4 sections. The first is the rise of neurodiversity. So that's just kind of a bit of a history on autism, the timeline of autism from its initial discoveries to where we are today with the neurodiversity movement. Next up, we've got terminology. So I'm just going to be going over some terms to get everyone on the same page about what terms the autistic community prefers when referring to autistic folks. After that, we've got autistic traits, which is a bit of a chunky section. I've got lots of information on common traits of autism, a lot of misconceptions, stereotypes. I go right into the DSM. And some info on how to implement those traits in your characters, in your stories, with the hope that it'll help you make as authentic of autistic characters as possible. And wrapping it up, we've got the do's and don'ts of autistic representation, where I'm going to be going into some of my favorite and absolute least favorite representations of autistic characters in the media over the last few decades. So the rise of neurodiversity. So throughout autism's history, there have been kind of 3 main phases, and those phases have been defined by who is really controlling the narrative at that point. So first up, we've got the scientists. I've got here a couple of your basic looking white guys from the 1940s. We've got Dr. Lee O'Connor, who did his work in America. He made his first publication on autism in 1943. Where he had about 11 kids, I think, that he was working with, and he believed autism to be this super rare, super niche condition. He told people like your other doctors, like it's likely that you're never going to see one of these cases in your entire career. He's a bit wrong on that one. And then we've got Dr. Hans Asperger, who is Austrian. He made his first big publication in 1944. He worked in a children's hospital that was actually really progressive for the time. It focused a lot on rehabilitation. And part of his work was that he viewed autism as a spectrum. And I should say that both of these individuals, it's weird. It's kind of one of the big coincidences in history. And there's a little bit of controversy around this, whether they actually, but it seems that they actually kind of came to this conclusion on this condition at relatively the same time. So yeah, Hans Asperger, he viewed autism as a spectrum. He had a quote, I don't remember the exact wording, but it was basically that once you know what autism is, you start seeing it everywhere, and that autism is a phenotype really. And he is a bit controversial because, you know, we've got Austrian in the 1940s. It was revealed in 2010 that or some information came to light regarding the fact that in order to maintain the position that he had at the university, he would have had to sign allegiance, loyalty to Hitler and the Nazi Party. So, and so he definitely had some ties to the Nazi Party, unfortunately. However, his allegiance exactly, it's not very clear, and it seems to be more on the positive side, because really this work that he was doing, he was presenting about his little professors, he called them, which were individuals that yes, they did have deficits in social areas, but they also had a lot of abilities that they could bring, a lot of worth that they had for society, and so what his work ended up actually saving lives, because he was showing in the era of eugenics and that movement, he was showing the worth of these children who were otherwise overlooked. The next phase that we have going on is the parents controlling the narrative, and that began in the 1960s and unfortunately is still present to a degree today. It was really driven by this fear of an autism epidemic, which was when the numbers of autism were rising due to a lot of reasons other than an epidemic. It had to do with just kind of awareness and things, and this was all, especially during the early 2000s. The autism epidemic was a big thing. There was a lot of fear mongering related to it, and during this time, a lot of lobby groups were rising up, run by parents, and one of their key goals was to increase the education opportunities for their kids. Which, hey, that's cool. I'm all for education. Unfortunately, the other side of it was that they were funding research, and this research was not about ways to help autistic individuals deal with some of the more negative comorbidities of the condition. It was research into how to cure autism, and which a whole no-go, and each was a bunch of super aggressive names for their groups and for legislation. Like it was things like defeat autism now and cure autism now, and there was this legislation that went out called the Combating Autism Act, and so it was just a super yucky time in terms of the ableism. It was a lot. It was very degrading for autistic individuals, and during this time, it was in part the birth of the autism mum, which continues to this day, and along with that, the normalization of a bunch of abusive therapies that the purpose of them effectively was to remove the autism from the child or the adult, but this was a lot focused on children, and a bunch of pseudoscience treatments that were really, really funky, and I mean like drinking your own pee funky. And so after this, the shift, the phase kind of that we're seeing that's emerging now is autistics themselves controlling the narrative. And so this really, if we were to pinpoint a moment where this movement really began, it was in 1993. Jim Sinclair, which by the way, like go him, he went to this conference in Toronto, and these conferences they were really dominated by parents who were sharing their info on how they thought it would be best to cure autism and remove autism. And he went up and gave this incredible speech called "Don't Mourn for Us," where he talked about the influence on autistic individuals that all of this rhetoric about wanting to cure them meant. And so it had things like when a parent says to their autistic child that, like, I wish you weren't autistic, that really how the individual, how we interpret that is like, you wish that I didn't exist. You wish that this part of me that's innate, that's part of my identity, just wasn't there. And so he's fantastic. He went on to do further advocacy work, started his website. 1996, we have the first time that neurodiversity as a term is used by Judy Singer, who's autistic herself, and she used it in her honors thesis. Neurodiversity, which by the way, I'm going to be getting a bit more into the definition of in the next slide, it really entered the mainstream in 1998 when there was an article in The Atlantic by Harvey Bloom, where he described, and I really love this description, it is the core of neurodiversity, is that neurodiversity may be every bit as crucial for the human race as biodiversity is for life in general. And then 2006, we have ASAN was founded by Ari Neiman, and ASAN is the Autistic Self-Advocacy Network with and it really rose in combat to a lot of those parent groups that I was talking about at the time, like especially Autism Speaks is, unfortunately, it's one of the more popular or the more publicly known organizations at this time, but it is very strongly from that parents phase and from parents speaking for their autistic children, which is unfortunate because they are really speaking for them and speaking for autistic adults instead of including the autistic individuals themselves in the conversations. And so ASAN rose with this slogan, "Nothing about us without us," which is really crucial to the mission of ASAN, is autistic individuals themselves rising up and being part of these conversations about themselves and about how they want to be treated, about research, ethics, morals. And so ASAN is wonderful. It's the strongest organization that we have today for autistics themselves. And of course, all of this kind of positive emergence about autism and autistic people being able, or kind of having worth themselves, not relying on other people to speak for them. It was facilitated by the emergence of a bunch of publicly successful autistics. And I say publicly successful because there are so many autistics that are successful, but these are some that really enter the public eye. We've got Dan Aykroyd. He was involved in the writing process and starred in Ghostbusters. Temple Grandin, who she works mainly in the animal infrastructure industry, organizing or designing tracks and machinery that's used in the animal industry. And Satoshi, and I should mention, and she's also she's very public about her autism and gives lots of speeches and talks about how she perceives the world, how the world is for her, and her autistic experiences. And Satoshi Tajiri, who I've got in the bottom right here, who I'm personally very grateful for. He's the creator of Pokemon. So go him. His special interest growing up was bug collecting, and that's really his passion for it is what enabled him to create the Pokemon industry and Game Freak. So thanks to him. So the neurodiversity, yeah, I've mentioned it kind of as a term over the past few slides, but what is it really? It is a movement that's based on the concept that there's so much variation in cognitive functioning, and all of that variation, it's just a natural part of diversity in the human race, the same way that we have different behaviors and different hair colors and all of the other hundreds and thousands of variables that that we vary on. It's just another natural aspect of that. Now, neurodiversity in comparison to autism, where autism is a diagnosis, it's a condition, neurodiversity is more of a social identity. It's something that individuals self-identify as. It's part of a community. And so it's a very broad term. It doesn't only describe like autistic functioning. It's the whole slew of all conditions that cause cognitive patterns that they differ from the typical cognitive functions of the general population. As a neuroscientist, I've always found this concept kind of funky, because I know that in terms of neural functioning, everyone is different. Like there are certain generalizations, of course, that I can make, that if I were to pop open your skull and poke around, I'd know generally where some of your motor areas are and what's going to happen if I stimulate certain areas. But when it comes down to the neurons, to all the connections, we are all different. And so this neurodiversity movement, it's really about the acceptance that a lot of those the functional differences that can be seen, they're wonderful, that they're something that should be supported. People should be proud of them, because we need diversity in the human race. That's just part of who we are. So next up, we've got terminology. And so just kind of, continuing with the neurodiversity, I've got some antonyms here. So we're talking about neurodiversity, the social identity. So individuals who are neurodiverse, we refer to ourselves as neurodivergent. And then the antonym for that, so someone who is not in the neurodiverse community, they're referred to as neurotypical, or you may just see shorthand NT. Now, autism, that is specific to the condition. So the trait, people who have autism are autistic, and the antonym to that, an individual who's not autistic, is allistic, is the term that's used for them. And that brings us into a bit of a controversy, the person first versus identity first language. Now, previously we talked about kind of those phases in autism's history, and the person first language, so saying things like a person with autism, they have autism, that really comes from the parent phase, where parents were trying to separate autism, trying to separate that from the identity of their child, which at its base does seem like an okay notion. It's the idea that autism doesn't define everything that their child is, but the kind of the flip side of that, and what autistic individuals and advocates have come forward with is saying that really doing that to separate an autistic person from their autism, it really separates the person in the condition, when that's just not the case with autism. Autism is an inherent part of our experience. It's something that permeates every experience with perceptions of the world and understandings of the world, and so that's where a lot of autistic individuals, especially, they're proud of that identity, and so as opposed to the separation from the parent phase, there is a strong preference for identity first language within the autistic community. So that's saying things like an autistic person, or they are autistic. And some individuals within the community, they do still prefer person first. It is pretty heavily leaning on the identity first, but my advice to you is, if you are an holistic individual and you're talking with an autistic person and they're using person first language, adapt to that, kind of the same way that you would if you were a non-queer person talking to a queer person. The terminology that they use, you adapt to that, because it's their community and you want to use what they're comfortable with. Asperger's. So this is a diagnosis that I'm pretty sure you all will have heard of. And it has been you don't hear about it as much anymore. And the reason for that is that it only actually existed as a diagnosis between 1994 and 2013. And so it was used really for a subset of autistic individuals who generally had later onset of symptoms, and their intellectual functionings were either at average or above average. However, in the DSM-5, which, by the way, for anyone that doesn't know, it's kind of like the Bible of psychiatric conditions, where psychiatrists can go in and see the specific criteria for all of the accepted psychiatric conditions that are currently known or kind of defined as existing. So in the DSM-5, they took Asperger's and kind of what we refer to as classical autism, and a few other developmental disorders that were in the same range, like pervasive developmental disorder not otherwise specified, and they plumped them all together into this one spectrum, autism spectrum disorder, or ASD. And so the idea there is that really it is a spectrum, and the individuals that were previously diagnosed as Asperger's, they are one point on that very wide spectrum. The term is still used sometimes by popular media and by some autistics, just because it was such a strong identity. There are a lot of people that still identify as specifically being or having Asperger's, and like you might hear the shorthand kind of is Aspies. So it is still a rather strong community, but it's not a diagnosis that's made anymore. Next up, we've got functioning language. So I will warn you, this is a very big pet peeve of mine, is this idea of high versus low functioning. And kind of there are two problems with this. The first is that it really is misleading. I like how Hannah Gadsby says, she's got this quote from her stand-up Douglas: "I have what's called high-functioning autism, which is a terrible name for what I have because it gives the impression that I function highly. I do not." And this is really something that we see in all parts of the spectrum, is that as it is with holistic individuals, people have strengths and weaknesses, and the kind of the separation, the extremes of those, they may be observed a bit more with autistic individuals. But like myself, for example, I've done literal rocket science. I do neuroscience. That's my thing. But I cannot take the bus. I don't know what it is, but like I get on a bus and it's just not happening. We tried learning buses. I tried, like I was working with the person in high school. We tried like learning bus routes. My brain just does not compute bus routes. But neuroscience, we're good to go. And so this is kind of where it's misleading that there are kind of these both these struggles and weaknesses, and it really only highlights one of those areas. And the other side of it is that it's offensive. You wouldn't just walk up to an allistic individual and say like, "Hi, are you high or low functioning?" And that's literally something that people have come up to me and asked, and it's just not cool to say to anybody. And so within the community, what we generally prefer is saying high or low support needs. So instead of high or low functioning, you just saying like they have high support needs, they have low support needs. I will note on this though that if you don't need to give any classifications, just don't. In the vast majority of cases, it's really not necessary to define whether an individual has high or low support needs. But if, for example, you're making a pitch, or you're pitching your story, or something else that really you need to define your character more closely. For characters, it's okay, but for people, just if you don't need to use it, just don't. And just kind of the support needs, it's also reflected in the DSM-5, where they give levels to the diagnosis of autism. And I really like this idea as a concept. It sounds kind of fun. Like, I want to level up and be a level 64 autistic warlock. That sounds like a cool life goal, but not quite how it works. The three levels are actually, they're also defined based on support needs. So that brings us up to autistic traits. And like I warned, this section, it is a bit chunky, so I'm hoping to help you through that. I pulled things directly from the DSM-5. And the purpose of that, as I said before, is just to really help you, as any creators who are watching this, create as authentic autistic characters as possible. And so in the DSM-5, the diagnosis is broken into three main criteria. The first criterion really has to do with social communication. And so the symptoms that it lists, which here I call characteristics, are first deficits in social emotional reciprocity, then deficits in nonverbal behaviors used for social interaction, and lastly, deficits in developing and maintaining relationships appropriate to the developmental level. And autistic individuals, part of the diagnosis is portrayal of all three of these three characteristics. Now, those are kind of some big clunky words. So to break that down for you in traits that we would actually see in individuals, or that you would want to put in your characters, when we're talking about social emotional reciprocity, that's really the give and take kind of conversations. And part of what that comes down to is that a lot of autistic folks lack what's called theory of mind, which is kind of the ability to think about the fact that other people are thinking, and that therefore they can have different interests and opinions for yours. This was a very important concept for me, really helped me stop giving everyone the Christmas gifts that I wanted. That was definitely a part of me growing up. And so how you might see this in autistic individuals is when they're having conversations, they might really focus in on topics that they enjoy, on their own interests and ideas. And especially if it's something that they're passionate about, they might not realize when their conversational partner is getting bored or displaying some kind of behavior that's trying to tell them that they want to leave the conversation. Now, deficits in nonverbal behaviors, that can include body cues, like I was talking about with the conversations, misreading cues. It's happened so many times for me that someone goes in for like that ambiguous, like, is this a handshake? Is it a high five? Is it a hug? And you just kind of, whoa, it's kind of like that all the time. The cues are misinterpreted, and the incorrect, technically, response is made. Another thing that we see is atypical eye contact. Now, in the media, this is something I'm going to talk about. A lot of the time, we just kind of see the extreme. We see characters just not making eye contact whatsoever. And while this is the case for a number of autistic individuals, a lot of the time there's more of a spectrum to eye contact. Similarly to how there's a spectrum of autism. Spectrums are a really big part of life. And this is just another one where a lot of individuals, they might make eye contact for just specific periods during a conversation. So maybe while they're talking or while they're listening, they might just give eye contact for that specific part and then look away. Or conversely, there are some individuals who either as part of their socialization process were really taught to like focus on eye contact, or they just are really big fans of eye contact. They might stare the entire conversation and never look away. And so that's why here I just broadly say it as atypical eye contact, because it's just eye contact that you wouldn't typically, or phenotypes, kind of characteristics that you wouldn't typically see with neurotypical individuals. Now, the whole deficits in developing and maintaining relationships, it's a little bit funky. I don't quite like how they classify this in the DSM-5 because it's a bit misleading. Autistic individuals are totally capable of forming close relationships. That is a misconception that we see a lot, is just seeing autistic individuals as loners. And it's true that because of the differences in kind of the ways that we process the world, it can be hard to for autistic people to connect with others. But this does not mean that they're not capable of close relationships. Often with autistic individuals, what we'll see is that they just have a couple of close friends, a couple of people that they're really strongly bonded with, instead of having a super wide network of people that they talk to casually all the time. And this is also true of romantic relationships. Not every autistic individual is motivated or wants a romantic relationship, but those who do are totally capable of it. There just needs to be a lot of communication in place in terms of expectations. I can make a whole other presentation on that. That'd be fun. Criterion 2 all has to do with patterns of behavior. And so we've got 4 characteristics here, and part of the diagnosis process is autistic individuals demonstrate at least 2 or more of the following. The first up is excessive adherence to routines, ritualized patterns of verbal or nonverbal behavior, or excessive resistance to change. Very common one. The next up is highly restricted, fixated interests that are abnormal or intense in focus, hyper or hyporeactivity to sensory input, or unusual interest in sensory aspects of environment, and lastly, stereotyped or repetitive speech, motor movements, or use of objects. So like I said here, the first point, the adherence to routines, to rituals, the having big problems with change, that is a very common characteristic. And so it's definitely something that if you're writing an autistic character, you want to include struggles with change and wanting to stick to a routine. And struggles with change, but was absolutely like the grand scale things like moving to a different school, a different house, the death of someone who's in your life, though those are big things, obviously, to deal with. But for a lot of autistic people, it's even the small things that the changes can really upset the balance. Like something that it embarrasses me to a point, because I know that it's such a small thing. I know that it shouldn't bother me. But even when packaging changes for me, like a while back, Quakers changed the oatmeal packaging. That was a bad day for me, and a lot of bad days following. I'm better now. I've accepted it, but I just wanted to explain it. Like even small things like that. And also just to note, I'm throwing in some of my individual experiences in this, just to give an example of some real life kind of perspectives. But of course, the things my specific experiences, not every autistic person is bothered by the Quaker's oatmeal box changing. I just want to give lots of examples kind of how these traits manifest in real life. Now, when it comes to those restricted and fixated interests, those are what we call in the community special interests. And so in the media, kind of the one that you see most frequently is trains. And I will admit, I like trains. I think the thing is that they're so linear, like they go one direction or the other direction, unless there's something bad happening. But just there's kind of the simplicity in that. But I do not want to perpetuate that stereotype. There are so many special interests. Individuals, a special interest can be in anything. Really, there are certain individuals who are obsessed, like with very specific, very niche, like facts about car engines. But these obsessions can also be with fandoms, with certain skills, like individuals might have a special interest in cooking. Just pretty much any interest that you can think of, any topic, that's something that an autistic person may have as a special interest. Now, going on to the hyporeactivity when it comes to sensory inputs, this is also something that we see very commonly, and in fact, there's a very frequent comorbidity with autism called the sensory processing disorders, and what you might see in an individual, or you might want to put into a character, is that a lot of autistic folks have a hard time focusing or regulating in environments that are overwhelmingly stimulating. And these stimuli, they can come through any source. It can be visual, audio, smell, like olfactory, textures, anything. It's possible to be overwhelming. And so a lot of times when autistic folks are in bright or loud or busy environments, that's where they may have difficulty coping. And so what we see is that a lot of folks use tools that help them control their sensory input. So like me, these headphones are basically a part of my existence. They're part of my being. I never leave the house without them because they're really important to me in my auditory processing as noise canceling headphones. And so you see headphones, sunglasses, earplugs. I don't talk about them a lot here, but fidget toys, things tactile, sensory. There are tons of tools that autistic individuals use to help them cope. And then, yeah, like we talked about above, the having averse or positive reactions to specific stimuli. So I really focused on the averse reactions before, but just kind of for a lot of neurotypical individuals, when it comes to stimuli, like sure, NTs have some things that may be really good, like the smell of fresh cookies. But for a lot of autistic folks, or I mean, for a lot of neurotypical individuals, most stimuli are kind of in the center of the spectrum of like they're okay. There's don't really feel strongly about them. Whereas autistic individuals, the majority of stimuli are either really bad or really good. There's less of that in between going on. And so again, this refers to any kind of stimuli, smells, sounds, textures, visuals, proprioception, things about moving. They can all be super good or super bad. And yeah, part of this, like the textures, and things touching your body, comes into physical contact. So it's one of the stereotypes kind of that we see, that autistic individuals just don't like being touched, and that's not really the case. When it comes to physical contact, for the vast majority of autistics, there are certain situations where it's okay, certain types of contact that are okay, like maybe only squishy hugs and not light flutters. I know for me, it's very dependent on the person. I've got about 10 people that are allowed to hug me, and like I'm okay with hugging me in 90% of contexts. And then there's also just some trait that I haven't been able to identify. As a scientist, I'd love to break down if what like physically it is, but people, I'm either okay with them touching me or not okay. There's no in between. And so like, for example, Neil Patrick Harris, super cool dude, super friendly. I would not want him to hug me. I wouldn't be comfortable with that, even though he's super cool. I've got nothing against him. I just know that I would not be comfortable in Neil Patrick Harris hug. On the other hand, we've got like Kat Burrell. I've never met her, but I know for a fact that she could just keep me in those long arms all day long, and I'd be good to go. I would be totally comfortable with Cat Burrell hugs. And by the way, I do live in Edmonton, which is a 4-hour drive from where the Winona Earp filming happens. So, Cat or anyone else who sees this that has the ability, if you would like to help me with that experiment, I would really appreciate if you reached out. I'll be there in 4 hours. Um, and then yes, and the last point of our the last characteristic of this criterion, those repeated movements, and that comes down to something that we call stimming in the community, which gets its own slide. And so stims are repetitive behaviors that activate certain sensory systems. And again, I could just put it on record. This can be any sensory system. There are fidget toys for tactile. It can also be like flashing lights in front of you. I've got this super cool, like all of these LED lights come out, and I can just kind of flick them, and it's wonderful. I go off into the twilight zone. I'm no longer on Earth. I am just existing for those LEDs. They're great. And there are auditory stims, either people making noises themselves or listening to certain noises. Now, the purposes of these stims, a big one is helping with the regulation of hypo or hypersensitivity. Kind of by controlling sensory input, autistic folks are able to bring themselves back to a point with their sensory input where they're comfortable. It also helps to increase focus, expressing emotions. That's another big. There are a lot of misconceptions out there about autism and emotions, and I am here to tell you that autistics 100% experience emotions, and sometimes even to greater strengths than neurotypicals. The only difference is that there are differences in how they're expressed, and so one of the ways that emotions are commonly expressed by autistic people is through stimming. And so like this lovely image that I've got off to the left here, that's what I call happy hands, is when you've got like the little like twitchies or just there are so many variations of happy hand stims, but that's a way that a lot of individuals express joy, express excitement, is through their body movements. And then also for, of course, channeling excess energy if you've got too much energy. And this is something that we see in neurotypicals as well, is things like when you have had that person in your class who clicks the pen on and off or jiggles their leg the entire time. Stims are absolutely seen in everyone in the population, autistic or not. But for autistic, stims are typically very important to their regulation. It's not something, it's very harmful to suppress stims in autistic individuals, because it hurts them both in their ability to cope in their environment and express themselves. So stims are awesome. Support stimming. The third and last criteria is about the onset and severity. So we've got that symptoms must be present in early childhood, but may not fully manifest until social demands exceed limited capacities. And also that symptoms together limit and impair everyday functioning. So when it comes to that first point about being in early childhood, that's really referring to less than age 8. And so how that translates to if you're a creator, if you're creating autistic characters, is that you want to make sure that autistic traits and experiences are included in your character's backstory. And unfortunately, part of that is that your character likely would have been bullied for who they are. Hopefully, you're able to power through and things got better for them, but that can definitely be that's definitely a part of most of the characters' backstories. An interesting posit on this may not fully manifest. What that's referring to is something that I'll be getting onto in the next slide. Is that a lot of is the ability of individuals to mask, and so yeah, I think I'm just going to get into that in the next slide. But how we may see that in characters and individuals is that symptoms may be the symptoms that an individual is presenting may be related to the stressors in their environment. So whereas in one environment they may be able to control, to make themselves appear completely neurotypical in a different environment with different variables, they may appear more autistic. And then the limiting and impairing everyday functioning. Of course, autism, it is, again, there's this whole funky thing with like the neurodiversity movement, but it is classified as like within the DSM-5 as a condition. So part of that is that there is an effect on daily life, and so in a character, you may see that this is impairing the character's ability to reach their goals when we're looking at character story arcs and things. But really importantly, autistic people absolutely can reach their goals. There just might be accommodations that need to be put in place, and so that can be part of your creative process. Part of their story arc is finding these conditions in which they thrive and are able to reach their goals. That brings. I thought I had masking up next. Never mind. We're going to hold off for a sec for masking because we're going to be talking about gender and autism. So this is a super interesting topic, actually. I won't get too far into the politics of it, but would be totally happy to chat with you in the future about it if you want to reach out. But what we see is that more genetic males are diagnosed with autism than genetic females. But a really important part of that is that it does not mean that more genetic males actually have autism than females. And part of what we see is that there's a correlation between IQ levels and autism. So when we've got individuals who experience quite severe impairments with IQ of less than 50, the ratio is 1.3 males to 1 female. Whereas when you've got what was previously classified as Asperger's, you've got a 11 males to 1 female ratio, with the overall ratio, regardless of IQ, being about 4 males to 1 female. And so that there is a lot of disparity going on there, and that will also be part of masking that I'm going to talk about. And a big part of this has been that research historically has been directed only at the male phenotype, and so that's the characteristics that are portrayed by males with autism, and it's a really nasty cycle going on because, like historically and today, more research is done about males, genetic males who are autistic. And so that means that the information that we have is largely about autistic males. And that means that males are easier to diagnose. They're easier to spot the symptoms in terms of when you look at reports on things like teachers picking out autistic kids in their class, they're much more likely to identify and be able to recognize the genetic males in their class or in so we've got that then it means that less females are being diagnosed, and when you've got less females diagnosed, that means that when you're doing your studies, there are more males available than females, and it just continues in this cycle of males having more research done on them and being this gap between the diagnosis ratios just increasing. And then the other part of this is that individuals who are raised and socialized as girls, they have a greater tendency to mask, which is what we're getting on to next. So masking is when a neurodivergent individual uses strategies to try to make themselves appear more neurotypical. And so why we see this in individuals who are socialized as girls more is back to just another reason why the gender binary does not help us at all. Individuals who are socialized as girls in the majority of cultures, there's a much bigger focus on suppressing things and on not having outbursts and on being proper. And so what that leads to is a lot of autistic females, whereas individuals who are socialized as boys are taught that like it's okay to be kind of explosive and to be really expressive. Like the males in that case, they'll have meltdowns that primarily are big and you know, have the really easy to see signs like the thrashing and vocalizations, whereas females absolutely also experience the big meltdowns, but a lot of their experiences, a lot of their thing when they're having problems coping, it's internalized, and so we see more things like shutdowns and overloads, where these people who are socialized as girls really kind of curl into themselves instead of having the explosive symptoms, which makes it harder for harder to recognize autistic traits. And then again, girls can totally have the big outbursts also, but it's just as a general rule, there's more internalization, which then also leads to anxiety and depression and a whole slew of other horrible comorbidities. And so masking, already mentioned what it is. So it typically requires training and a lot of conscious awareness. And so this training, it can either come from things like therapies, which again, a lot of them are inherently abusive because they're trying to train people to look neurotypical, but a lot of individuals also themselves kind of train themselves on masking techniques because, unfortunately, in the society that we live in, there are certain things that can only be achieved if you appear neurotypical, things like in job interviews, in just navigating society in general. There are less opportunities, unfortunately, when you present as neurodivergent. And so like for me personally, I remember kind of this self-training going back to as young as 3 years old. And like my big first kind of character study that I did, was Billy Piper's Rose Tyler in Doctor Who, and I remember I'd have it on my TV, and I'd watch like what she was doing, and then I'd run to the bathroom to the mirror, and I tried to like copy her face, like the little like smile that she has, and I try to copy her behaviors and mimic kind of like her vocalizations, and then I'd run back to the TV and I'd go to the next frame and get another expression, and then go run back to the bathroom, and I just did this back and forth where I was teaching myself how to express things in the same way that this individual who I saw as a role model did. Most recently, I did a kind of one of these character studies on Saran Jones' portrayal of Anne Lister. So I totally have the gay power walk down now. Definitely want to be a bit more like Anne Lister. I have no regrets in going into that character study. But that's where, yeah, this training, it can come from the individuals themselves. If especially their experiences, the responses of the world around them, kind of communicates that this is a necessity. Now masking, because it requires all this conscious awareness, it is very energy consuming. It's very tiring, and kind of part of the extension of that is that it can be very harmful to an individual's mental health, using up all this energy all the time just to appear like something that they're not. And then it also causes problems with identity, because there's this issue of people, when you always have to pretend to be something that you're not, if that switch is on the majority of the day, you kind of lose a part of yourself and a part of who you are innately, and that's really sad, because autism and neurodiversity as a whole, they can be so beautiful. There are so many positive characteristics and so much variation that is just wonderful, and it's lost unfortunately through masking. I wrote, it has some masking, kind of has some similarities to being in the closet, in terms of it's hiding this inherent, this innate, this part of you that is unchanging. And then on here, so I mentioned I love cephalopods. I have in my notes that I'm not allowed to say anything about these pictures other than they are mimic octopuses, which are wonderful, and you should Google them because they are absolutely fascinating, but I'm not allowed to talk to them. So just mimic octopuses. Go for it. And then this is a super cool topic. This is something that I am absolutely fascinated in. And it's kind of why I do the advocacy work that I do. I work a lot at kind of the intersection of the queer and neurodivergent communities, because it is a massive intersection. There is so much overlap between the two communities. And so I've got some numbers here. I love numbers that were from a study by De Winter in 2017. the Netherlands, I believe. And these numbers are just astounding. So the table 1 that I've got has to do with gender identity. Unfortunately, they only included the statistics from for the autistic individuals and not the allistic ones that were involved in the study, which I found pretty disappointing because I love controls. I love the scientific method. But what they found is that individuals and also they did not include any info on intersex individuals, which was a bit of a gap that is definitely a gap in scientific or in the academic world across all spectrums. And I'm really hoping that more research is done into intersex individuals specifically. But here we've got individuals who are male or female. Biologically, 92% of the autistic males identified as cisgender, so that leaves 8% as identifying as something other than cisgender. And the females, this number, this is wild. 77%, only 77% of the genetic females identified as cisgender, leaving 23% to be non-cisgender. And they did break it down into, they had a few different categories for gender non-conforming folks. And so that I've attached the, I've cited the study, so you can go check out the exact numbers if you want. But just that number itself, that's astounding. That's a quarter of autistic biological females that are identifying as something non-cisgender. This is huge, and this isn't a small study either. I think they had about 800 autistic individuals, and then a couple thousand neurotypicals that they surveyed. And so this is a significant number that definitely deviates from the allistic population. And then when it comes to gender or sexual orientation, here we've got the autistic men identified, 81.6% of them identified as straight or attracted to women only, whereas for allistics we had there were 90.4% that identified as straight, leaving almost 20% of autistic males identifying as something other than attracted to women only. And about half and then a degree, about half of that number or that portion of allistic individuals identifying as something other than straight. And then again, if we get on, okay, and I should note here that they didn't include a category for gender nonconforming individuals, which I found a little bit confusing, given that in the previous the previous data, they had identified that so many of these individuals were not only trans, but other gender identities also. So I'm not sure exactly what happened to these numbers here. They weren't very clear, which was a bit disappointing, but they did make the differentiation that they broke this chart into men and women instead of males and females. So this is based on gender, not sex. And so for the women, going back to it, these numbers, again, this is so significant. This the autistic women, only 56.6% of them identified as being straight, compared to 87% of allistics, leaving 43.4% of the autistic women to identify as something other than straight. Again, that is a huge number, and this is not something that we see reflected in media. I don't know of any off the top of my head characters, autistic characters that are also queer. It's not something that's looked into. So this is a very big intersection, and this is something that if you're a creator, you should really look at the overlap between these communities when creating narratives. And then a couple misconceptions. A lot of these I've gone over already. So I went over the emotions, how for autistic people, just the common difference is that they're presented differently. In addition to that, autistic people are totally capable of empathy. it just may require, it just may look different for autistic individuals. It may include different reasonings behind it, but autistic individuals are totally capable of having empathy, sympathy, everything that goes with it. Again, are capable of having close relationships. They might engage in eye contact. I talked about that, where just for a lot of the community, it's different from what you would see in a neurotypical individual in terms of their behaviors, how long they spend making eye contact versus not. The enjoying particular kinds of physical contact in specific situations. Again, Kat Burrell, I'm good to go with my hugging experiments. Just let me know. I'm 4 hours away. Another thing, autistic individuals are very rarely savants. This is, we're going to be getting on to next, characters in the media, and you'll see that the majority of them are savants. And you know what? I get it. I get why Hollywood is so interested in this idea of the savant, because they do make super compelling characters. You've got these characters who have almost supernatural abilities in a lot of portrayals, and that can really help with bringing forward the plot, with making compelling characters. But when you're talking about autistic representation, it's just not realistic. There is a lot of variation in terms of reports throughout different studies of what percentage of the population has savant abilities, which is, just to clarify, it's abilities that exceed the abilities of the neurotypical population. And these come in a wide variety. Some of the most common ones have to do with calculations and like mathematical abilities, with memory, and then art and music are two big ones that we also see there. The number of autistic individuals with perfect pitch is wild in comparison to the holistic population. That's a really big overlap. But when we're looking at savant traits, again, the number isn't exactly agreed on, but everyone can pretty much agree that it's less than 20% of the population. So less than 1 out of 5 autistic individuals has savant abilities. And so this is a problem when we're looking at the media, because it's created this image that autistic people have these abilities, that's just something that you should expect out of everyone that's autistic, and that's not the case. There are so many things that autistic people offer in terms of diversity beyond savant abilities, and so that's something that it's really important going forward in media. I hope that we see more autistic non-savants kind of as role models for individuals, to show that savant abilities aren't the only thing that gives value to an autistic individual. There's so many other beautiful parts of autism, are capable of succeeding when supported. So this is something that I was talking about with those environments, where part of, if you're a creator writing a story, you might want to show environments where the character is not supported and has difficulties, versus a environment where they have accommodations, where they have supports and are able to reach their goals. That's really important for showing the fact that some of these accommodations, they can be so small, but once these things are thought about, once they're put into place, they can have such a massive impact on autistic individuals' ability to function. And lastly, I'm just such a big fan of diversity, and this is not something that we see in all of the cis het white males that are represented as kind of the stereotype for autism. Autism occurs in all races and comes from all socioeconomic backgrounds. Any subpopulation on the planet has autistic people. They are part of every culture. And that brings us on to our last section, the do's and don'ts of autistic characters. So how I've set this up is I've chosen 8 characters, ranging from the worst of the worst, and I mean like terrible, to my favorite representation to date. And we'll go over kind of some of the things that I like and don't like about them, and the impacts that they've had on the community. Okay, so again, the worst of the worst. Sugar Mata from Glee. Um, Wow, I mean, Glee already is problematic. For those of you who don't know, we've got Sugar Mata. She comes on for her audition, and this really summarizes so much of the problem that I have for her. She comes on for her audition, and the first thing that she says is, "I'm Sugar Mata, and I have self-diagnosed Asperger's, so I can pretty much say whatever I want." So, unpacking that a little bit. Um, After that, she does not demonstrate any autistic traits. She just does not. The only thing the only trait kind of that she shows is that she makes a bunch of inappropriate, insensitive, rude, offensive remarks, and then she uses her Asperger's as an excuse, her self-diagnosed Asperger's, I should say, as an excuse for these comments to kind of validify her ability to say them. And this is just so gross. I hate this so much. First of all, self-diagnosed there's already quite a bit to unpack there, where yes, there are some situations where individuals are kind of forced to be self-diagnosed if for example, they're in a country that they don't have access to the diagnosis process. But unfortunately, something that we see a lot in the autism community is these individuals who are self-diagnosed when really it just comes down to social anxiety, and they don't really understand the full affect kind of everything that defines being autistic. And so, yes, absolutely, social anxiety is something that the majority of autistic individuals have just based on their experiences, and there are a lot of experiences that individuals with social anxiety and autism, or just introverts as a whole, can relate to, but they really, social anxiety does not equal autism. As we talked about in the characteristics, there are so many more aspects that go into the autistic phenotype, and so again, she just doesn't she just doesn't portray them. She's just rude, and so it's comedy by just making fun. It's first of all, it's a bad joke. Like, it's not even that funny just to have her say these really horrendous things. So just horrible. If you want to know what not to do with your autistic character, all of this. Okay. Next up, we've got Sheldon Cooper. Now, I want to say that I have a very complex relationship with Sheldon, because he was really the first character on TV that I was able to that I saw myself represented in, that I was able to associate with, other than Spock. Spock also, which we've got some red flags there, and so for Sheldon, he was a really big part of my experience growing up, and there were a lot of things that I adapted from him. A lot of like terminology, things like social convention. That was something that I knew the concept of, but I didn't have a term for it. I didn't know how to ask people, like, what is the social convention in this situation? And so there was a lot that I learned from Sheldon that was positive, but at the same time, the way that he's portrayed, the way that especially his relationships with other people, the show and with its laugh track, it also taught me that a lot of kind of my innate characteristics, that a big part of who I am, is something that should be laughed at, that shouldn't be taken seriously. Something that it's okay for other people to make fun of, and to do things that set me off on purpose. I thought that was acceptable because that was what I saw through the show, and that was, and still is, really harmful. I let people do things to me. I let people like say things and make jokes that weren't okay, that were really demeaning. Because I thought that was part of me. I was like Sheldon. People would just laugh at me. That was just part of my life, and it's taken a very long time and a lot of effort to get myself to a place where I know that I deserve better than that, and that I can be proud of of my quirks, kind of, instead of needing to hide them so that I'm not laughed at. And it has been a really wonderful journey. That I have found people who now love me not despite those characteristics, but because of them. And so I have recovered from that, but Sheldon just really needs new friends. So that's where I definitely owe something to Sheldon for that representation, but ultimately it was really quite harmful to the community. Also, the fact that he became kind of the stereotype for autism portrayal in the media. And that brings us on to Little Sheldon. Now, for Sam Gardner from the show Atypical, which for anyone who doesn't know, it's a show on Netflix that for which Sam Gardner is the protagonist, and he's autistic, so focuses everything is on his autistic experiences. I decided to separate him into season 1 Sam Gardner and season 2 and 3 we're going to see later on my in the representations that I actually enjoyed, because season 1 was just an absolute miss. He was the embodiment of the autism stereotype. He wasn't a character. He was a caricature. One thing that like from gosh, it was like the first episode in, I just did not get it. What is this obsession with autistics wearing long sleeve shirts under t-shirts? Like, I don't know about any of you that might be watching this, but I don't like clothing. That's not sensory fun. I'd be nude all the time if I could, honestly. And so this idea of like putting on 2 shirts, why do you need that? And where have we seen this before? Oh, yep. So it's just really playing into the stereotype. He was like mini Sheldon. And what they seemed to do was they just really packed like all of these autistic characteristics without really making Sam his own character. All of his character traits were just autism, and that's not cool. That's not realistic in a character. So the show, I really felt like it was aimed towards neurotypicals in season 1. We've got things like this quote that he said in the trailer, sometimes I wish I was normal. And so that like, I suppose, of course there are autistics that feel that way. I know that I've gone through phases where I felt that way. But it's not a perception that's shared by the autistic community as a whole. A lot of people were talking about the neurodiversity movement, that autism is actually something to be proud of for a lot of people in the community. And really in Atypical in the season 1, they were doing a lot of things where they were blaming Sam for a lot of the problems that like the family was having. Things like, I'm pretty sure there's one point where his mom Elsa effectively says that he's the reason that she had an affair, which just goes back again to this that whole, this is the reason that I went over the history. It really goes back to that parent phase of autism's history, and so I really felt like the season 1, it was really focused on neurotypicals perspectives, and this idea that Sam was kind of a burden for those around him. And this was not helped by the fact that there was only one autistic actor in the series at this point, or at least one known autistic actor, and he wasn't even in that many episodes. He was in 3, I believe. And so there wasn't enough autistic involvement in season 1. Next up, we've got Virginia Dixon from Grey's Anatomy. She came in for in season 5. She only ended up being in 3 episodes, but kind of her character. There was a cardiothoracic surgeon. The head of cardiothoracic surgery had just left, and so the main guy, the chief, he had asked these doctors to kind of woo Dixon and into encouraging her to become the new head of cardiothoracic surgery. And so the first episode that she comes in, she doesn't actually tell anyone that she's autistic until the end of the episode. And that's really powerful, because what we see throughout that episode is that she's made fun of, and it's really visible the way that the other characters, they don't understand her, and as a part of that, they don't have enough respect for her. she is portrayed absolutely beautifully. I love how they set up her character. She, something that I love is that whereas with Sam, when we were talking about him being a caricature, for Dixon, they really blended a bunch of autistic traits, so it's things like we were talking about previously, the eye contact. Dixon, she's not on either end of the extreme. She will make eye contact with someone and then look away, and then she might make eye contact again later. She does have that variation, which is really great to see, because that's something that we don't commonly see in media. And so I really liked that they were showing this wide variety with her. Where kind of my problem comes in with her is that there was no character arc. And so this is, of course, from a more analytical perspective. So yeah, I loved how they, her character, how they built her character, how she was presented. But there are things like, there's one episode where this family's daughter has died. She's brain dead, and Dixon is struggling because she knows from purely logical perspective, it's time to harvest this girl's organ. She's brain dead. She's not coming back. And the longer they wait, the less viable the organs are. And she's really struggling with the fact that the family isn't able to accept this because of the emotional factors. And so what I would have liked to have seen a character arc with her, where through her relationships at the hospital, she gains a larger understanding of empathy, and a larger understanding of the fact that there aren't only logical aspects to those conversations. Whereas her character arc, it was flat. There were no significant changes in the first episode that she was in versus the last one. What we did see was the character arc of those around her. There was a positive arc, and so that I appreciated. We saw it especially in Bailey and Yang, which are the doctors that in this image are hugging her. We see them from going from being quite judgmental to in this episode that I've got here. This is her last episode, I believe. We see her have a meltdown, which is something that is very important. This I could have included its own slide, actually. She gets overwhelmed because first, Bailey, the doctor on the right, she says something to the patient. She suggests a treatment plan without actually talking to Dixon about it first, and so that takes her off guard. This is like we were talking about with the difficulties with change. It's hard for her to process, so she's already a bit buzzy, and then one of the patients gets excited and comes over and hugs her, or the patient's parents, and that sets her off. She starts having a meltdown. She gets overwhelmed. You can see that she's stimming in a way that she's expressing negative emotions, and Bailey comes and finds her in this attendance lounge, and I really loved this interaction, because Bailey, who yes, she does have OCD. She is portrayed as having OCD. For the main part, she's neurotypical, and so we see this holistic individual coming in and seeing this autistic individual who's obviously struggling, and instead of making assumptions, she asks, "What can I do?" And that is so important. That's that scene specifically, in whatever form, is something that I think should be included in all representations of autistic characters in media. Is this this really healthy exchange of or just kind of allowing the autistic individual to tell you how to help them instead of just assuming things. And Dixon says, like come hold me, and she's getting a squishy hug, and which is something I also benefit from, squishy hugs. It's and she explains, I like, because she goes into like kind of the sciencey, and it comes into the Temple Grandin idea, and like this, how they suppress, or how they compress cows in order to decrease the sympathetic function, or decrease the sympathetic functionings, and it slows all the bodily systems down, and so we see this really positive scene where Bailey has gone from being kind of judgmental to understanding that even though she doesn't fully understand, as you can see from her face in this, and Yang and her, they're a little bit questioning, she still knows that this is what she has to do. She still respects Dr. Dixon to follow through on this, even though it's not something that you would typically see. That brings us on to Sam Gardner from seasons 2 and 3, which are so much better. And I would say that largely this is due to the fact that they bring more autistic people into the process. They actually ended up bringing in 5 autistic actors to form kind of his peer group, which was really wonderful. And definitely between season 1 and season 2, there were a lot of people from the autistic community who wrote in expressing their dismay about the whole situation. And I've got to hand it to the creative team. They really took that advice, and in seasons 2 and 3, they really evolved Sam from being an individual who's just defined by his autism, from just having that traits. Like, yeah, he did have things like Antarctica, but really all of his character traits were really autism central. They went beyond that to really flesh him out more as a well-rounded character. And I definitely noticed a shift from the perspective I was talking about before, that it was very from like that parent phase, that we were seeing a lot of the perspective of the family and this idea of kind of the burden, and we were shifting there to Sam's experience, and to the experience of his peers. And there are some really healthy there are some really good scenes that I love from these seasons. One thing is that, like I mentioned, for Dixon, they do show a meltdown for him. They show him on the bus. I think that might have actually been season 1. I can't recall precisely, but they show him having a meltdown on the bus, and then something that's also really important, that's my dog, something that's also really important is in season 2. They show him being picked up by the cops because they think that he's like on drugs or is tripping out because of the way that he's behaving, when of course he's not. He's just stimming. He's just having issues communicating with the cops because he's autistic. And this is something that I haven't talked about publicly, but this is an experience that I've had also. I've had cops and peace officers come up to me. I've had security follow me and things, and typically I mask quite strongly while I'm in public, but in some situations I just get overwhelmed and I lose the ability to mask a bit, and it is scary. I don't want to trigger anybody or go too in depth, but this is a big problem, especially for people of color, and this is why a big part of why these representations are so important, to kind of normalize these experiences, to normalize these characteristics, so that hopefully in the future, individuals, when they see meltdowns, which may appear aggressive, but in most cases really aren't, like there may be vocalizations and like some thrashing and things. The goal isn't aggression. These aren't aggressive people, and so I really hope that through representations of things like meltdowns and overloads in the media, we can normalize that to the point where individuals who see these things happening in public, they can respond more in the way that Bailey did in this, instead of becoming defensive and seeing this as a threat. They can instead ask what they can do, and they can recognize, like, oh, maybe this individual is autistic. Maybe I need to reduce some of the sensory. Maybe that'll help. And so that's a big part of why I find representation important, is to normalize both the behaviors and to really solidify the what the reaction should be to them, especially in asking how you can help. And we've got Sean Murphy. Okay, so I talked before about how I was not fond of savants, but Sean Murphy is totally my number 3. I love him. And again, like I was talking about previously, he a big part of this is that they show overloads, they show meltdowns, they show at one point like he punches his mentor, and it's not because he wants to hurt his mentor. And of course, I'm not saying that physical violence is ever acceptable, but we can kind of understand why it happened. He was really overwhelmed. The mentor was coming in on him, and it was just a reflex that he ended up hitting him. So we see things like that. The show, I was actually introduced to it when my best friend told me to watch it, because she just kind of called me up and said, like okay, so there's this show and this doctor, he's you. And so I think that that's part of why I love him so much, is that I can relate on so many things. It like it starts with him in the first scene, it's got him stacking his Rubik's cubes on each other, which like Rubik's cubes. And then I love really, because he is the protagonist, and I love how they focus on his experiences. And so like a part of how they do this is through visualization techniques. They have they use overlays. So for example, in the first scene, he's leaving his house and walking out in the neighborhood, and it shows this path that he's making, where he's planning to walk, kind of in like a Google Maps GPS kind of configuration. Or when he's working through problems that involve physiology, it shows him taking these complex diagrams in his mind and expanding them and manipulating them, which is a really beautiful representation of visual thinking, which is experienced by some autistic individuals like Temple Grandin. And so again, like I don't want to support savants as a whole on them in media, but damn, I really love The Good Doctor and Sean Murphy. Now, number 2, Entrapta from She-Ra and the Princesses of Power. I think I only started watching this a couple of weeks ago, and mainly because I found out that there were both queer and autistic characters, and I mean, those two together, man, I'm there. And so Entrapta, she's one of the princesses, and she is autistic, and part of this is that Noelle Stevenson, the writer for the show, she has she had a storyboard artist, Sam Szymanski, I think it was, that was involved on the show, and she ended up involving him really heavily in Entrapta's character development, and she talked to him a lot about creating her arcs, and it's wonderful because she is just so beautifully unproblematic. She is just such excellent representation, and just such a great example of what happens when you include autistic people in the creative process. And so like I said, she kind of exists in her own world, and like technically she ends up working for the bad guys, but she doesn't even know that she's working for the bad guys really, because all that she wants to do is develop her tech. She just exists in her own world. She makes her own best friend, who's a robot, Emily, and she just lives. And something on top of this, she is a she. This is something that we don't see nearly often enough in media, is representations of women with autism, because that is a whole community, and it's severely underrepresented. And so that's another just wonderful thing about Entrapta. So just like, as Nicole Hott would say, this top shelf, man, top shelf. Just this is fantastic. And then my number 1, Billy Cranston from Power Rangers 2017. So wow. Okay. So I should note that like him and Entrapta, I was really struggling to kind of choose who went in the top. And especially a big part of that is because I love diversity, and of course they're both diverse. Entrapta, like she's a female, which we don't commonly see, and Billy, in case you haven't noticed, pretty much everyone else has been white so far, and Billy Cranston is not, and it's so cool. I know I personally can't speak to what it's like not having representations of individuals with the same skin color as me on TV. That's not part of my experience, so I can't speak to really how much this means. But I can say that autistic Black superheroes are exactly what we need. It is so good. Like when I found out that there was going to be an autistic Power Ranger, and specifically that it was going to be blue, because blue is, I will see, you know, the whole theory of mind, it is my opinion, but truly blue is the best color. And so just all of this coming together, I had to go and like lie down and just do some breathing exercises to chill out, because I love this so much. A big part of it is that in comparison to where we were talking about Sheldon, where like when the laugh track comes on, when people are laughing at him, a lot of the time it's because of his struggles. In comparison, Billy, we're not laughing at the autism, we're laughing at kind of, I put in like some situational irony that occurs. There's one scene where Billy just kind of accidentally blew up the side of a hill, and he's yelling because he can't control the volume of his voice, and Jason says to him, like, you don't need to yell, and he goes, okay, and like continues yelling, and that's the kind of thing where we're not laughing at autism, we're laughing at the irony of the situation. And it's something that Billy would laugh at also. It's something that people with autism can laugh along with, because it's not making fun of the condition. And then like later on, we've got they all fall into the pit, into this water, and the color of their gems is glowing, and so there's Zach, who is obviously he's Asian. He's got the black gem, and so he says, like, I'm black, and Billy goes, what? And Zach says, I'm black, and Billy goes, no, you're not. And again, it's funny because of the irony. If we explained to Billy why Zach was saying that he was black, then Billy would laugh at what he had said also. He would understand that it was just a misunderstanding. So again, the comedy, it's coming not from laughing at Zach, or laughing at autism. It's coming just from the irony of the situation. And so Billy, along with that, he is not a caricature. He is a fully developed character. They give him all of his own experiences, and he's just so much more realistic than the caricatures that we see. He's so much more believable as a character. The one note that I have on him as a negative, and this unfortunately is true for all of the cases that I've talked about so far, is that he's unfortunately not played by an autistic actor, which is something that is really common. And it's kind of a similar conversation to what we have in the queer community, with when straight actors are given queer roles. That it's like, of course, acting, it's part of it is assuming this character that you're not, but it is taking away roles from marginalized individuals, and it is relying on experiences that you don't yourself have, so definitely it's something that I want to see in the future. I want to see more autistic actors taking these roles. And that brings us to our three key points of the presentation. The first one, I I don't know how many times I have said this or can say this, but diversity is everything. What the main harm that the media has done to the autistic community is through just purveying this message that there was one phenotype, kind of one autistic character. We just the savant, cis het white male, and that's not true. We see in realistically that is such a small subpopulation of the spectrum, whereas on the spectrum there are individuals from all sexualities, gender identities, races, like I said, like socioeconomic backgrounds, intellectual capacities. There is so much diversity on the spectrum, so the way that we've kind of come up with just this one stereotype, it really hurts, because autistic individuals, of course, we've seen how important it is to have individuals who you can relate with in popular media, and that's just something that is not experienced by the majority of autistic people, because that stereotype, it represents such a small subpopulation. Yes, and so yeah, it's something that recently we've seen, like with the queer community. I'm so proud of everything that's been happening with the queer community, and everything that has moved forwards, and how many more queer characters we're seeing, healthy representations on TV, and I've been impacted personally by like Kasima and all of them. I coming from a generation where I had the original L word was kind of my main representation. There has been so much healthy representation that's coming forward, and so much positive has come from that. And so the same way that the queer community has experienced that, I really want it to be something that the autistic community experiences also. The second point is getting autistic people involved. As a creator, you have the power to kind of control who's involved in the processes. And so whether you like write fan fiction or screenplays or whatever you do, there are opportunities to get autistic people involved. And I plead, like I've talked about, there is so much that autistic people have to offer that's often overlooked. So many beautiful things that can happen when autistic people are part of the creative process. And like I was saying with the autistic actors, like, of course, we've seen the power of having characters that you can relate to on TV, but the autistic community, it lacks having adults, having role models, and so just imagine the power that could come not only from seeing yourself in the character, but from seeing yourself in these individuals who are portraying the characters. It's There is so much power that comes from seeing yourself represented. And so I want to see that on both the fictional side and backstage, getting people involved. And the third point is that you have the power to make change. Every time that we create something, all creators have the ability, through the way that they represent individuals, to change how minorities are perceived by the general population. Media plays a massive role in controlling how minorities are perceived as a whole, and so by introducing these healthy characters, by showing their positive attributes, there's so much good that can be done. So many positives. They come. It's like, sorry, it's 10 p.m. here. I'm getting sleepy brain. But I'm not gonna. Almost done. So you have the power to make the change. You have the power to empower these communities to increase how they're positive, how they're positively seen by the community as a whole. So thank you for anyone who's stuck around. As I said in the beginning, this is something that I'm super passionate about. And so making this presentation, doing this presentation, it was a really fun experience for me. If you have anything that you want to reach out to me about, I would be so happy. Like I said, this is something that's really important to me, so I would be more than happy to consult with you. If you are maybe a creator who's building a character and you want some consultation in that process, or as I mentioned before, I'm also a performer. I'm pretty versatile in the performance world, and so I'd also be thrilled to be involved in your projects. And so you can reach out to me. Feel free to email me, whether you're seeing this like a week after it's posted or in like 5 years. It's all good. Feel free to reach out to me. And I've got there my Twitter and Instagram. Also, my handle is Cal Klimperk. And so feel free to reach out to me there. So again, thank you. I hope that this presentation has been informative for you, that that you have a greater understanding for the importance of autistic representation in the media. So thank you. Signing off.